Hi everyone, I'm Annalisa from C.A.C. Global Solution. I'm here with Brett for another episode of our podcast, Aviation Perspectives with C.A.C. And today we are going to talk about the type certificate datasheet, and we are going to dig into this topic with a returning guest. He's an aircraft certification and international regulatory affairs expert, Adam Bakos. Adam, welcome back and thank you for your time.
Oh, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I appreciate you inviting me back, and I look forward to our thorough discussion today.
Yeah. Thank you for your efficiency. It's really nice when we have to work together. You are on point, on time. Thank you very much for that.
My pleasure. That's how I work.
Okay, so we would like to talk about a type certificate datasheet because it is a document that is very important, has a lot of information that are very useful for people involved in aircraft management, particularly people who deal with transition aircraft and such. So before we dig into a particular type certificate datasheet, I would like for you to give a brief explanation of what a type certificate and a type certificate datasheet is, just very briefly.
So the type certificate actually is just a pretty document, but that is the document that says, okay, that this type or whatever type it is approved. And the type certificate data sheet is it's a very important document because it contains the certification basis of the product. So that's the rules, regulations, standards in force on the date of application, any special conditions, exemptions, ELOS, basic information about the product, its operating envelope, how many passengers, approved manuals, those kind of things. So it's a very important guide for, a kind of a quick snapshot at what this product is, what it's certified to, and important documents and other references that are important for that type.
Okay, perfect.
I was just reading the other day, Adam, that certain other documents can constitute part of the type certificate data sheet. For instance, the sections of the flight manual may be considered part of the data sheet where they impose limitations on operational limits of the aircraft. Is that right?
So I guess it depends. There could be specific notes, for example, like at the bottom, at the end of TCDSs, there are often notes explaining things. So there could be, an operational limitation, or that a certain pre-approval has to be done before an aircraft is imported, or that a certain modification has to be on before it has to be imported. So yes, but I would say kind of at large, that's probably more of a unique situation. Mostly, the TCDS is going to reference the approved manuals and just say, okay, this is the flight manual and this is its document number. It's not going to call out specific parts of it, but it also depends. The authorities are different. The TCDS format is evolving. In the past, for example, on the TCDS or on TCDSs for different countries, they would list, approved fuel types and approved oil types and those kind of things, which are in the flight manual. And now, rather than listing them all out, they just say, see the approved flight, see the flight manual. So there is an evolution to the format and what is included in the TCDS as well.
Okay, perfect. So today we are going to look into the type certificate datasheet of a G7500 Bombardier product. So because it's a Bombardier product, we are going to look first at the Transport Canada TCDS, and then I would like to make some comments on the EASA and FAA TCDS, just to see differences and styles.
Yeah, so just so you know, I have them up here too, so I can look at them for reference too. And
that's perfect. Yeah, while we talk about all of these different points, I will make sure that in the interview there is going to be like a screenshot of the piece from the CDS so that people can understand what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, I would like to talk about this marketing name because I was looking for the CDS number, and I went with the G7500, but I had a little bit of hard time finding it. So can you spare a few words about this marketing name that the TC holder gives to their products? I know
Sure.
also you have some comments.
Yeah, of course. I guess full disclosure, I did work for Bombardier for 13 years. So, there's obviously, I can talk about as much as I can about, public information. I actually didn't work that much on the 7500. I primarily worked on the 56, 55, 6500. But yeah, it's pretty standard. The company, whichever company, in this case, we're talking about Bombardier, but, companies are going to come up with their product lines. And usually they want them numerically similar, or they want the numbers to represent, the range of the product or whatever it is. So there is an official model designation, and that, the product is known by. But OEMs, type certificate holders can come up with marketing designations, and the marketing designations will be called out in the TCDS, or different serial number ranges might be called something different, and those would be described in the notes of the TCDS. So yeah, you want to go by the model because that is the legal type, but the marketing designations are kind of the colloquial names that the products go by, but that relation has to be there because you don't want to have confusion.
Yeah, exactly. And in this specific case, this type certificate datasheet is called, the number is A177. And in one of the notes, it's a note 2.5, they say Global 7500, previously known as Global 7000, is a marketing designation for the BD/700/2A12 aircraft serial numbers 70005 and subsequent. So there you go. There in this note, you have your relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's the other thing. If the marketing designation changes for whatever reason, then they've been in an earlier iteration of the TCDS and might list something. You kind of have to show the evolution of that. So this note reflects that it originally was known as a 7000, but now it's known as a 7500. But it's still the same model type.
Yeah. From a regulatory perspective, I find not everybody's clear on this because I've seen many aircraft where people go to register them as a Falcon 8X or a Gulfstream G650 or Boeing 737 MAX, where those are all commercial designators. They're not the actual aircraft model or type.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's important for people to understand that when registering your aircraft or making an application for a CFA, for instance, typically what we would do at Transport Canada is we would require a digital photo of the aircraft data plate, because the aircraft data plate pretty much always will specify what the technical designation for that model is, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there can be confusion, but that's why, authorities try to, spell it out as best as possible in the TCDS. But yeah, not everyone realizes the importance of using the model, and operators, they just might use the kind of commercial name, but it is very important to identify what it is and what that relationship is.
Right. And another aspect that I'd just like to point out while we're talking about type certificate data sheets and type certificates is, for instance, I've seen a number of aircraft undergo cargo conversions. Well, and it may be done to an STC, it may be done to a service bulletin. It really depends on what data is being used, right?
Right.
But typically in that data, there will be an instruction to replace the data plate to reflect the new model status of the aircraft, the technical model status, right? And that would be an instance where an owner of an aircraft may have to resubmit an application for registration to reflect the new model designation, right?
Yeah, that's exactly possible. I mean, in the end, all the paperwork has to align, and if you're doing design changes and it's going to change it Then again, depends on the status. If it's the OEM doing the design change, then yeah, per their procedures and their airworthiness operational procedures, that may precipitate a model change, or maybe not, depends. But if it's an STC holder, exactly, and if it's going to change it, then the STC holder is taking responsibility for those changes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So another thing that I have noticed in my research, and we are going through a lot of information. Some are going to be basic for some people, and some they are not going to be very basic, because we have a broad audience. So I would like to make sure that everybody is on the same page and can get something out of this interview. In my research, I have noticed, I think I was on the FAA search engine for the type certificate datasheet, and they had Bombardier Inc. and they also had Bombardier Aerospace. And I wasn't sure exactly on which one was responsible for the G7500. Do you have any comments on these different type certificate holder names?
So it's not just Bombardier, but type certificate holder names change. If I remember correctly, the reason that Bombardier changed was because there used to be, Bombardier Transportation, and there was Bombardier Recreational Services. There was all these, there's Bombardier Commercial Aircraft, so all these branches. So, as the company evolved, they changed the name, and it happens with other OEMs as well. So it's still the same company, but over time, if they decide to change the name of the organization, that doesn't automatically precipitate, a document revision. So at the next available opportunity, when a document like a TCDS, for example, is revised, then the applicant could take the opportunity with the authority to revise that name. So in the end, it's all the same company, but that just kind of shows you the evolution of the name of the company. That's all.
All right.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what I've seen. It is, like you say, if it's a minor change where principal ownership hasn't really changed, then you may wait till next revision. I've also seen examples like with Embraer, where the principal ownership of the company has changed, so they shift everything over to it's a requirement, right? Because the responsible party. So in those cases, it'll be immediate, and typically the design authority will send instruction to, maybe not instruction rather, but notice to the other authorities that have issued type certificates based on that type, that design type, that they need to update their data sheets, their type certificates to reflect new ownership and responsibility for type, right?
Mm.
Yeah, that's true, and that's two different aspects. In this case, it's the same company,
right?
But just the name of the business unit or name of the company had changed. But if you look at, for example, when Bombardier sold all the type certificates to Longview and Viking, and they're all now under one umbrella, yes, you're completely right. Now all of those TCs, TCDSs, everything has to reflect the new owner, and therefore there's a mass exercise on type certificate transfer and renaming of everything and those kind of things. So that is that larger exercise that you're talking about. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so for this type certificate datasheet in particular, so this A177 Transport Canada TCDS covers 3 different types, and we determined, thanks to that note in the CDS, that the 7500 is this model BD 700 2A12. So there are different sections of the TCDS, and one section, which is section 3, describe the characteristics of the 7500. I point this out because it's very important for aircraft management people to identify where exactly your model starts in TCDS, so that you can get the exact information that you need. I was wondering if you can comment on this part where they say type certification configuration. They mention a document, RAOBA 700-049, and I was wondering if you can comment on this.
Yeah, so each manufacturer has to have an approved type design configuration document of some type, because you need to know what is installed on the product when it's being shipped out. This is also called the engineering configuration statement, the ECS. So it's a requirement to have, so you know what's on the aircraft as it's built and it's going out the factory doors, because as the product is being evolved and design changes are being incorporated, and there's many reasons for doing design changes. You have to know what's on the product, and least of which you need to know what's on the product because of continuing airworthiness items too. So that document in this case will contain what is actually installed in the aircraft that makes its minimum type certification configuration and what's on that product. So that document might include, for example, foreign validation status as well, what other countries the product is certified in, or validated in, I should say. It'll list if certain mods need to be incorporated to go into some of those countries. So, for example, if I remember correctly, Japan and Russia, for example, required certain modifications to be installed or not be installed, and therefore it has to be identified in some way. So, you identify what would be on the aircraft.
So a question regarding that, would, for instance, an FAA type certificate data sheet have a different RAO number for their configuration, or would it all be spelled out in the same RAO number under the design type certificate in order to define what's acceptable for each different state?
Right. So there would be two documents. So there's in this case, the RAO, that would contain the different type configurations for the different jurisdictions. So there would be a Canadian one, there'd be FAA, there'd be EASA, and wherever else the product is validated. And they will reference, or there will be a reference as well, as I'm looking at the note here on the TCDS, there's a RAL document. That's the one I was talking about, the engineering configuration statement. So between those two, the product, as it goes out the door based on the serial number and that RAO, depending on what jurisdiction that product is going to, that's the type configuration for the product. So at least how Bombardier did it, that was all contained within one document. Whether or not other OEMs do it differently, they could have a different document for each different authority. But yeah, that's what that note is saying. It's all contained within that one document. So in the FAA one, it would be the same document.
Okay. So I have a question. I've never took delivery of a 7500. So I'm not sure, is this document something that is provided to the client, or is something that stays with the TC holder?
Actually, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know if it's received on the client side. I know, authorities need it to know what the configuration is. I know you need it for C of A and export C of A, but whether or not the actual owner or operator gets a copy, I'm not quite sure on that.
Yeah, I've done 7,500 deliveries, and I actually don't recall offhand, but I will comment that it's type certificate holder specific on whether they'll provide it or not. Because I've gone into some facilities where the manufacturer type certificate holder will not give the client that design definition document, because what they want is they want complete control over, for instance, if the aircraft is changing jurisdictions and they want the client to come to them and ask them to assist in defining what's required to change jurisdictions. So they want involvement in that activity, where if and I have seen the other side where, for instance, they may identify the change of state requirements in a service bulletin, so that if you operate your aircraft under a certain state, these are the requirements that need to be met, and this is how the aircraft meets it, right? So in that instance, the operator themselves can go through the list, and you could go through the aircraft records and determine whether it meets the requirements or not, where not all type certificate holders want to do that. It's kind of funny. Some are more protective of their information than others.
Yeah, I just don't recall, but I could see manufacturers, OEMs, because that's information the authority needs, not necessarily the operator, that if the operator needed to do that, then that would be some kind of commercial arrangement that would, you'd have to provide compensation for. But to your point about the service bulletins, yes, completely. I recall a number of jurisdictions when we would validate, and exactly, we would have a separate service bulletin, and everything that needed to be on that product was done. So it's like, okay, you have a kind of a canned service bulletin. You go, okay, we're going to that country. Make sure this service bulletin's installed there, and that service bulletin contained all the the design changes necessary to be able to operate there.
Right.
Interesting. Okay. Moving on, we just after this part, we have approved publications and instructions for continued airworthiness. I see they mentioned the aircraft flight manual and the airworthiness limitations publications. So are these the only manuals that you would need to maintain the aircraft? And one question that I have, why the MRBR is not listed there?
Right. So I guess to answer your first question, no, these are not the only documents that are required for the operation of the aircraft. Only the documents that are listed on the TCDS are, the approved manuals. When I use that, I use capital A, approved, meaning there has to be an authority approval. So at least in the Canadian framework, the changes to a flight manual, there may be small delegation that Transport Canada might give design approval organizations to do approvals, but generally anything of consequence has to be approved by the authority. So that's why approved manuals. So that's the AWL, AFM are referenced. ICAs are also referenced because you have the opportunity to, and it's a good quick reference to kind of list the main documents. But no, there's wiring documents, illustrated parts catalog, weight and balance manual. There's all these other manuals that are required for the upkeep and to ensure that the aircraft maintains its airworthiness that aren't listed on the TCS because they don't need to be, because they're not capital A approved. There may be a small A approval by the OEM itself. That's in our case, Transport Canada has authorized, or because let's say an organization has a DAO, that they can do the approvals in-house, but they aren't approved capital A, like the flight manual AWL. So there, as long as the way it's written in CAR 521 is as long as there's a process acceptable to the minister, which in our case, Transport Canada administers on behalf of the Minister of Transport, then the OEM can do the publishing and the approval of those documents themselves, except for the AFM and AWL. Now, when you get to the MRBR, that document is, of course, an important one when you have a new type and you're trying to look at, MSG3 and zonal analysis, and get alignment amongst the authorities when you have the new type. But once the aircraft is in service, and the aircraft has its type, and how to do a type rating, and you have the material there to do that type training, it's not like, 10 years down the road, I need the MRBR report. It's like everything is based off of that going forward as part of the type certification process. So, it's not really something that needs to be referenced in the TCDS.
So, Adam, if you would, right now, in my mind, there's a lot of confusion between the MRB and what were we just talking? The MMRB, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
Right. Or even for that matter, how the MPD is derived from the MRB. Mm-hmm. A lot of people think that because something is in the MPD that anything in the MRB is not MRBR is not required. Can you just comment on that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not required. So the whole process to create the MRBR, that's what it is. It's a process. It's to how you were going to develop the tasks to maintain your product. So it's kind of like, I guess, the baseline or the first principles, if you will, about how we're going to develop tasks and how and what is appropriate for intervals and those kind of activities. So I don't necessarily need to write it here in a TCDS because the entire product is based off of that. But the kind of methodology or the how you get to that point to come up with your intervals. So for this particular item, it's 500 flight cycles, and this one is 500 landings, and this one is 1,000 flight cycles, and all those different things. That comes from that base analysis, and then everything else is based off of that. And then from those as well, you also have, evolution of that could also lead you into, your AWL and other things that have, intervals that have to be managed. And that leads you to, okay, well, this is now the cycle at which I need to manage my aircraft. Early in a product's life cycle, some of the limits and intervals might be low because you don't have the in-service history for, certain parts, certain assemblies, how they're going to last. But let's say you get to that 500 hour or 500 cycle, interval, and you go, oh, wow, the product doesn't have any, because we've done, the specialists have done an assessment of, well, this is what we think will happen, or this is when we think we might have to replace, or, and then you go in at that time, you go, wow, look, it's brand new, it doesn't have any issues. And that's that actual real life data of the product in service then gives the OEM the ammunition to then go sharpen their pencils, do further analysis to try to increase those task intervals and give more longevity and, have to have less downtime, less maintenance on the product, because now you have real live data for the product in service. And that's how intervals and limits start to get moved up as the product is in service, because you have a basis of which to make an argument for it. And of course, the operators are happy because that's less downtime, that's less cost that they have to spend. That's, changing parts or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I have a story I want to share. I was in a helicopter operators one time, and they were operating Bell 205s, and Bell had put a life limit on the main rotor blades. And so they operated, I think, 3 or 4 aircraft. And so they had a bunch of helicopter blades hanging around the hangar that had been replaced because they met the life limit. And one of the tech schools approached them for sample items. And so they cut them up and they provided them to the tech school. But lo and behold, the type certificate holder had applied for an extension to the life limit, and it was accepted. And now these things were no longer life limited. They were life limited, but it went from like 5,000 hours or cycles, whatever the case was, to 7,000. And these were now, they could be deemed to be serviceable main rotor blades. So, it's the kind of thing that you want to be wary of a little bit too going into it, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a very unique case, very interesting. But yeah, no, you're completely right. And what I always saw was that it makes it, I guess, more advantageous for OEMs to be able to increase those limits, like I said, because it's less cost, less downtime, and when you're trying to sell a product, then it makes it more of interest to potential buyers. But exactly, if you had a certain thing, you're like, oh, I want to give the thing away, and then you were able to get it in, get the thing increased. I guess lesson learned in their case.
Yeah, but I think, like you said, you have to be aware that these things are being analyzed all the time, and things could change, right?
Yeah,
So,
for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, so moving on to the other part here that we have right below approved publication and instruction for continued airworthiness, we have this datum. Would you like to explain what this note means?
So datum point is you have to understand the aircraft, how it's built and where it is in space, and the reference of what you're talking about. So where is it in reference to? So if I'm talking about fuse station such and such, or I'm talking, X number of meters or feet, but where is that to? Is that from the landing gear? Is that from the nose? Is that from the leading edge? What is the when we're, I remember when you were in school and you were in math class and you came up with the answer. The answer is 27. The math teacher would go, 27 what? Oranges, apples?
Right.
It's the same kind of thing. 50 feet from what, or 20 feet from what? So that's why the datum point is referenced, because that's for that product where it is in space. All the points are made in reference to. So if I'm going to a particular section of the aircraft or a fuselage station or whatever that is, it's going to be in reference to that point. So everybody knows, if I'm looking at a drawing, what I'm referring to.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that it's an arbitrary number that the design engineers come up with, right? I mean, it can be, I've seen with some aircraft where it's 100 inches forward of the nose of the aircraft.
Yeah.
It can be anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Moving on, we have fuel, like you were saying. Now they say see applicable AFM as listed in approved publication. You were just mentioning that. And another thing that I wanted to point out, the TCDS tells you what kind of APU and engines models this aircraft can install. Sometimes I think you have a pretty good story about it. An aircraft can change the engine model based on an STC. Would you guys like to comment on this?
Well, on the 7500, I don't think you would see that. But certainly with other aircraft that have been in service for some time, I mean, and it can be a case where a type certificate holder has different options for engines. But that's you'll see that quite often with airliners, commercial airliners, where an airline, when they're composing their fleet, they may have a number of aircraft that operate a certain types, certain OEMs engines, and they want to keep that, and that may be an option in the type certificate of an aircraft. So that's an election that they would do. But in other instances, I've seen where it's done in by type certificate, particularly some small helicopters. It's quite common for things like this. And I have one story where they did this. The aircraft had been imported and exported in and out of Canada a few times. And then I was importing it into the state where I was working, and everything. I mean, it's important to understand with an STC, there's typically a supplement to the AFM that comes with the STC. And in this particular instance, I asked to see the supplement, and they had the supplement. I was going through the supplement, and in the supplement, there are engine markings, a red line for different parameters and such. And they embodied the STC. They changed the engine to a different make of of engine, but they hadn't changed the instrument markings. So what they thought was a red line they were operating the original engine to was in fact not the red line they should have been operating the aircraft to. So there's little twists that you have to pay attention to in those circumstances. Have you seen change of engine types in different aircraft?
No, not personally. When I was at Bombardier, I was involved in the 6500, but it was a new engine, but it was same manufacturer. It was a new engine model designation. But yeah, I mean, of course, the plates and everything would have to change to reflect the new engine model designation. But no, I wasn't involved in anything, I guess that intimate.
Right,
Yeah.
right, okay.
So I suspect that if you want to change your engine through an STC, the STC holder is responsible for the documentation and stuff like that. But is it possible that a type certificate holder can recommend two different types of engine in the TCDS?
So that's a unique thing that you bring up, because I'm trying to think of like some conversions to, if you had like an old aircraft and you want to put like a more efficient, like a turboprop on it or something. Yes, the STC holder is responsible for it, but let's be realistic. I mean, they're going to have to go to the OEM and say, hey, listen, and again, that might be some kind of commercial arrangement, because the STC holder is not going to be privy to all the information, because obviously that original engine was integrated on that fuselage. So the new, if they're going to do a new engine by STC, yes, the STC holder takes responsibility, but it's unavoidable. How am I going to integrate that new engine on the aircraft without talking to the people who built the aircraft? I mean, maybe it's possible, but I would say it would be very challenging. And then again, yeah, so the OEM TCDS is not going to change. That STC holder is now going to be responsible for that configuration with that new engine installed on it. So I've actually never seen if that would look like as a supplement to the TCDS, or if it changes in that capacity, or how the STC holder takes responsibility for it. But I would imagine it would be something like that. Yeah.
Just in regard to that, so if I mean, this is we may come to it a little later, and I apologize if I'm jumping ahead here, but when an aircraft comes onto a civil aviation register, for instance, and I mean, you have to evidence that the aircraft meets type and is safe for flight. So the aircraft meets type. Now, the type certificate may be at a certain revision level at that time. Okay, but and say the aircraft came on the register 10 years ago, and now it changes registers and is going on to another register, and the applicant is trying to state that the aircraft now meets type. But the type certificate quite often changes in those 10 years, and the aircraft may not meet type at the new revision.
Right.
Right. So what would happen in a circumstance like that?
So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think back to my work years ago, but essentially it would be our responsibility, or the OEM's responsibility, with their National Civil Aviation Authority, to the authority that they're importing the product to say, okay, since the last time you saw it, and we saw this a lot with countries we didn't import a lot to, but obviously we had done a validation, but something like maybe kind of level 2 authorities were like in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia. It's like, okay, well, the last time we had a product imported was this, and this was the configuration. Here's the new, here's where we are now, and this is the delta, and this is what we've done since then. Actually, as I'm talking, I remember doing exercises with Brazil even, and with ANAC, and they were like, okay, we'd like to see what the delta is from the last import to this import, and what were those design changes. Now there's a bilateral with ANAC. There wasn't in those days. There was a kind of a working procedure, which a lot of it got absorbed into the bilateral. But that was part of the exercise. Okay, they wanted to see all the flight manual changes. They wanted to see all of the major design changes. They didn't need to see minor ones. They just want to see all the major ones. So it'll be our responsibility. Okay, let's go into the database. Let's print up all the information. Let's put it in a nice table. We'll send it off, and they would ask questions or might be interested in or whatever. And then, towards the end of the validation exercise, they would take all of that data And then they would say, okay, this exercise, we looked at all this data. This is now accepted. Now TCDS, where it was previously at Rev 7, it's now at Rev 10. Your or our validated approval now represents, Rev 10 of your TCDS or your national authority's TCDS. So there is an exercise to go over that delta, because you're right. It met the type of configuration at that time, but what is the new product that's coming in, or if there have been design changes to that product. And if the product has been in the field, and for example, you're flipping registrations, you have a Canadian or FAA registration, and the plane has been out there for 10 years, and now you want to go to Brazil, well, they're going to have to do an exercise to say, okay, well, in this intervening period, these are the mods that have been incorporated on that aircraft.
Right. Well, it might not even be the mods. For instance, I've seen aircraft that were delivered, for instance, to a state, the FAA, EASA, an Airbus. Okay, and then it's imported into Canada, and Canada has a different requirement for ice protection for water drains in the belly, for instance. So while the aircraft met type in these other states, it didn't meet the type requirement for import into Canada. And there are, I mean, that's $1 million mod to put drain heat on the aircraft. But typically, I mean, in those situations, you can work with the regulator and maybe get time limited exemption, or there are different ways, different things you can do, right? But these are things that have to be looked at. I mean, if you think you're just going to import an aircraft and put it into service because it meets type, meeting type in one jurisdiction doesn't mean meeting type in another, right? So
no, that's a good point. And again, I've never been on the operator side, but I would imagine it often gets overlooked. But that's a very important distinction to make. And while at least my perception of different OEMs around the world, they do their best to have the major authorities' requirements looked after. Maybe in a particular case it's not, and then there are differences. A lot of very close. Everything's 95-98% the same, but those couple of percent do make a difference, and you have to know what jurisdiction you want to be operating in, what those differences are going to mean.
Yeah. What comes to mind is the recent Boeing 737 MAX. For instance, the flight manual procedures, the flight manual identified in the type certificate is different for EASA than what it is for Transport Canada or the FAA. And in that FOM, in the flight manual, the emergency procedures to address the recent accidents that had happened are different than in one jurisdiction than another. So, I mean, there are some substantial differences. Maybe they may seem minor, but some of the authorities have gone through the exercise and they have completely different perspectives or perceptions on what they consider major or not, right? So.
Right, and different authorities can have different supplements. I remember, dedicated supplements to ANAC or Australia or Russia. So again, it's where you're going to be operating. It's the requirements of that authority, how they're going to be met, and even if it's up to the OEM how they want to manage it. You can have a dedicated AFM that's 99% the same as everything else, but they have those couple of pages that are different for that authority that you're dealing with. Or you have one AFM that's applicable to everything, and then you have supplements that are managed differently depending on that jurisdiction.
Right. A very practical example that I've seen all the time is things like placards. Depending on what jurisdiction you're operating the aircraft in, the OEM may have different supplements to the AFM to designate which placards are required. It might be Chinese, might be Russian, might be Spanish, whatever it might be. It might be a language, or it might be additional certification requirements. Weight stickers on doors, drawers, and things like that, right? So
and there's and again, the majority of the requirements are very similar, but there could be what I what we talk about is additional technical conditions. So I think back to my time when I was, doing validations, and we wanted to put a product in China, for example. One of their requirements was, well, it has, the you have to have metric units. Well, that was okay. We had both metric and imperial, but at a minimum, you had to have metric. I remember JCAB had a requirement. I can't remember if it was a stick pusher or stick shaker, or you couldn't have both, or you had to have both. But again, it's like there's a little minutia for that particular authority, and you have to have it documented. Where is it captured? Is it captured in your certified configuration document? And does that procedure require procedure in the AFM? Because then maybe I've got a supplement in the AFM to support that as well.
Yeah. Actually, you just brought something to mind. I was doing an import on a Bombardier product, and it was coming from EASA land into Canada, and there was a service bulletin that the type certificate specifically stated, I forget which was which, but in one jurisdiction it had to be installed, another jurisdiction it could not be installed.
Exactly.
And it had to do with stick shaker and stall warning. And so that would be an example, for instance, where a service bulletin is actually absolutely mandatory because it's part of the certification of the aircraft.
Exactly. So, the work that the OEM would do to cater for that. And then also on the operator side and the import side and the inspector side, they have to know, hey, whichever jurisdiction I'm going to, I need this or I don't need this. Where is it? How do we take it on, and how do we put it on and take it off, kind of thing. Right. So that's the awareness. Yeah.
You bring up an interesting point, and I, if you wouldn't mind, if you just let us know your thoughts on it, or your position from a technical and professional perspective. But and I've seen a lot of instances where STCs are, or either minor or major mods, have been embodied under different using different data. For instance, FAA field approval or whatever. But these embodiments typically have the instructions for installation. Now, if you're importing the aircraft into another jurisdiction and they don't acknowledge or accept that data, quite often an operator will choose to remove or disembody the changes. But the data used to embody it rarely, I've seen in some instances that it has, but it rarely includes the information for removal of those same mods. So where would that leave a person from a certification perspective?
That's interesting. So I haven't come across that, but I'm just trying to think logically. That's actually a good point. I guess, again, it would probably come down to a commercial arrangement. You'd have to go back to the originator of the mod, in that case, whether it's STC holder or whether it's the OEM, and say, okay, we need to come up with, we'll have to pay for it, but we need to know how, you would uninstall this, this product. And, they can do that. But again, it just, it's going to be, there's going to be money changing hands to be able to do that. But that's really the only way that I can think of offhand, because you're right. Most of the time it's like, oh, it goes on and it stays on. I mean, if it's something simple like flight manual supplement, and everything's contained within it, you operate under this. I'm thinking of like noise restrictions, for example. If you're in a certain jurisdiction that has a noise limits or curfew times or things like that. Okay, I've now installed this in my flight manual. An AME, aircraft maintenance engineer, has signed off on it, stamped it. It's now in the book. And now I want to take that off. Okay, I'm just taking out the supplement, and an AME is stamping it and signing it again that it's been removed, and that is no longer part of the configuration of the aircraft. But if you've actually done some kind of physical modification to the aircraft to move things around or add something in, and you don't have the way to take it off. I can't see any other way but going back to the originator of who did that mod, whether it's the OEM or STC holder, and say, okay, well, we need to take this off because we're now either in contravention or we would not be airworthy having this on in this jurisdiction. How do I take it off? And then, that's part of just a commercial exercise.
Yeah, so you brought up an interesting point that I'd just like to go back on. You were talking about changes of configuration and changing supplements to the AFM. And the point that you brought up was the AME or AMP, whatever the case might be, the maintainer, needs to make an entry in the technical record for the aircraft. And
Yes.
Without that, it's not a legal change to the aircraft. So a lot of people miss that. They think putting a supplement in the AFM or pulling a supplement out of the AFM is a simple job. But I mean, physically, yes, it's simple, but technically it's a gotcha because a lot of people miss that part.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to own or operate or be the maintainer or maintain the operations of an aeronautical product, you're not doing this because it's necessarily easy. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of approvals, there's a lot of sign-offs for a reason, because that gives the integrity of the system and make sure that products are airworthy, and that that gives that supports the public's opinion of what should be safe, what is safe, and safe for the flying public. But yeah, all of these things require sign-offs, approvals, stamping, and if you don't know what's going on and off your aircraft, then when you go to sell that aircraft, how can you say hand over heart that I've taken care of it and everything that needed to be done was done, and everything was properly in the logbook, and everything was always written down. If you don't have that, your product, the value that you have in that investment is not going to be there. Like, people are not, if you don't have logbooks, if you don't have history of your aircraft, they're not going to pay top dollar to buy your aircraft. Even if you don't want to sell it, when you go to another jurisdiction, well, how do I know what's on or off this aircraft if I don't have proper paperwork?
Yeah, one simple example comes to mind is, again, going back to FAA 337 field approvals. I've seen many field approvals where they reference the documents that were used, but they don't include copies of the documents with it. And one example would be wiring diagrams where they've made changes to the wiring. Now, as a maintainer, as the owner of the aircraft, how can I maintain the aircraft if I don't have copies of those wiring diagrams that are referenced in the approval? Because you're completely lost without it. I mean, there might be a way to find your way back, but some of these can be so complex that it's almost impossible. You're financially, you may be better off just pulling whatever's there that's attached to it and starting from scratch.
Yeah, that's really tough. I mean, that's not necessarily my side of the business, but I wouldn't want to be in that situation. That's way too much work.
And that's why you have an airworthiness engineer that takes care of your aircraft and follow up on all of these things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I just want to point out that this may sound like I was getting a little off the mark here, but technically, when you do these things, you're no longer adhering to the type certification basis for the aircraft that it was in, or even the latest. You might have the aircraft was delivered meeting original type, and it may have embodied several STCs since, but each one of those becomes a new version of that certified aircraft.
Yeah.
And now if you alter it again, or if you stray away from it, you've now changed type. The aircraft no longer meets type and technically cannot hold a valid or an in-force C of A at that time until it again meets type.
Yeah, no, you're right. And you see this very often in transition aircraft, particularly when you have aircraft that comes from one jurisdiction to another. You just mention it a little bit. And yeah, this is why I wanted to have this conversation, because the TCDS has a lot of good information for aircraft management people that needs to be understood. Okay, so well, moving on to the next part, I would like to have your thoughts on the leveling means. It's on page 20. And yeah, I would like to know your thoughts, your explanation on this.
Yeah, so this is just another, this is just another kind of reference. Aircraft have to, before they get their C of A, they have to be weighed. You have to know, well, what is a level aircraft? So similar to the datum point, the reference point that you're making, all your reference to for your drawings. It's similarly the same kind of thing. It's talking about aircraft is leveled longitudinally and laterally by means of a plumb bob and target in the aft equipment fuselage station. So, it's saying if you're looking at that reference point, that's where it is. And that's how the aircraft is leveled. So again, it's just another reference to, again, if you're doing fueling or weighing of aircraft, or well, what is a level aircraft? Well, this is how it kind of its reference point, and it would be done.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you'll see the means of leveling and the leveling datum typically in the maintenance manual as well, because they're the procedure for leveling the aircraft, right? But that's an exercise that has to be done to almost all aircraft on scheduled basis in accordance with most regulation, right? So this is an example of where the maintainer is told specifically to reference, because every aircraft is in different location. And somebody working on one type of aircraft that now is going to another aircraft might use the seat rails in the cabin, which is common for some aircraft. So it's a point that just brings every scheduled interval brings everybody back to the same point. And also the envelope of the aircraft and the AFM, all of the calculations that are made are based on that point, right? So it's a very critical, very important point to focus on in so many aspects. But
yeah, and it's important to note because different aircraft are going to have different ways to do it or have different reference points. So you need to know how it is for this particular aircraft, and I guess taking some of what you said a little bit further, because if you're not doing what that particular aircraft is, then you could end up with problems that you're not now within the certificate envelope, or the things are potentially you wouldn't be utilizing the flight manual in the right way, or you would expect it to be a certain way and the aircraft is not responding in that way. And because every aircraft is different, you got to know, or every aircraft type is different, you have to know when you're doing maintenance and you're doing activities to this particular one, how this one is. Because if you have to set up toolings or whatever you need to do, it needs to be particular. You can't do on a Dassault what you're doing on a Boeing, what you're doing on a Gulfstream, what you're doing on a Bombardier. So
okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now another part that might be a little tricky, particularly for business jets, and which is the maximum occupants. So here they say 22, including the crew, and no more than 19 passengers. And they reference a note 2.1, which is on page 25. What I find interesting is that they say carriage of persons in the cabin is permitted when an approved seating arrangements and related required passenger provisions are incorporated in accordance with the certification basis. Would you like to make some comments on this? I said, it's a part that is a little tricky because very often business jet have a very specific configuration inside, and very often comes from STC, right?
yeah, so how this product is made is that the initial configuration was called the green aircraft. So it has a finished cockpit, but the interior is not installed. The interior is installed at a completion center. And there's a variety of ways of doing it. Some aircraft manufacturers or manufacturer can do it both ways. You have straight pipe where the type's design configuration includes the interior, or you have this is just the aircraft, it's ferried to a completion center, and then the interiors are installed by STC. Generally, that's for larger products that have more complex interiors and those kind of things. So in this case, it has 19 passengers or no more than 19 passengers in a certain configuration. And there's a particular reason for that, because at different seating configuration numbers, different requirements kick in. So you'll see a lot of private jets have 19 or less, because then they don't have to do, if they have 20 or more, certain requirements kick in like commercial aircraft. So that is an additional burden to OEMs. But anyways, that's kind of a little side tangent. But the actual green configuration, so it's set up, it's certified, or design configuration is frozen. You may have the installation of ferry kits. You move the product over to the completion center, and it's down for a number of months, and the interior is installed. And then, you also have an STC on top of it, and then you have your final C of A. Sometimes there's a kind of an interim C of A and a C of A payment. Generally a C of A is a payment. So different OEMs can do it different ways, or you can have the configuration frozen, not necessarily have a C of A, but there's different mechanisms for that. You fly it to the completion center, the interior is installed, and then you do the C of A with the interior installed. So that's really all it's getting at, is it's identifying, the TCS is identifying here that the interior is not part of the certificated type design.
Yeah, just from a regulator perspective, and an operating perspective, the relevance of this 19 passengers, in there, like Adam says, the standard that has to be applied for commercial operations is different than for private operations. And the way that some regulations are written is that if an aircraft is type certified for more than X number, 19 is typically the number, then these rules apply. So some operators think that they can just remove some seats through an STC or whatever, and that makes them eligible to fall under the lower category, where this is the type certification basis. So right from the start, if the type certificate limits it to 19 seats, that's how they kind of fall under that cutoff, that threshold. But beyond that, if you go through the exercise of type certificate, say you had a 22 passenger aircraft and you go through an STC exercise to remove 3 seats and bring it down to 19 passengers, typically now that's the certification basis for the aircraft, and you could qualify for that. But some operators, they don't go through that exercise. They think that simply by blocking off seats that they're now under the 19 seats, but they're not. It's got to be certification basis for the aircraft. So
yeah, it's true. And in this case, that the whole principle of the aircraft, how it was built, how it was designed, was built around having under 20 seats. So yeah, the TCDS is the law. This is the holy document, and unless that is changed, or changed through an STC or something, the applicable requirements, you'd have to meet the applicable requirements to follow, or it was certified to, in this case under 20, because at 20 there's a whole bunch of other commercial type of requirements that have to be met that these products would not meet.
Right. Yeah, one of the big ones is the cockpit door.
I was just thinking that actually.
Yeah,
I didn't want to say it, but I thought it.
Yeah, that one's usually so cost prohibitive that they wouldn't do it.
All right.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. Yeah.
Other
it's a
ones that
heavy
you see are like for the CBR requirements,
Right.
more than 6 passengers or things of that nature, right? So,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's all based on certification basis, not on what the operator thinks it is.
Yeah,
or
this is
Yeah.
a very, very good point. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, we have special conditions and equivalent safety findings, page 22 and 23. Can
Mhm.
you talk a little bit about that, what these special conditions are and what these equivalent safety findings are?
Right. So they form part of the certification basis. So I don't want to get too professorial because I teach this stuff. But suffice it to say that not everything that is put on an aircraft has requirements for it. Requirements are frozen in time. They evolve. Authorities add new requirements. If one authority adds requirements, some authorities may adopt them, that kind of thing. But let's be realistic, technology advances a lot quicker than necessarily regulatory requirements or guidance material for that matter. So the authorities had to come up with a way of saying, okay, well, how can we certify a product that doesn't have standards for it yet? So the mechanism is the special condition. The special condition covers new and novel equipment or technology that the authority would have to say, okay, if we're going to put this on the aircraft, but we don't have any standards in our regulatory framework, in Canada in the AWM or in FAA, the 14 CFR. In this case, it's AWM 525 or Part 25 in the FAA world. There are no requirements. So how are we going to be able to certify this part of the design on the product? So the authority is going to have to draft up an issue paper, which would be the vehicle to convey the special condition, and then come up with what would be deemed to be safe requirements for that technology. So if I look at some of them, vision system video with head-up display, or side stick controllers. So what that's saying is we don't have requirements for that. We need to now come up with requirements for that, and that we think would be acceptable at the authority level, and then that goes to the OEM, and then can the OEM meet those requirements? And that's why the vehicle is the issue paper to say, okay, here's the authority position, here's the requirements you're going to have to meet. Applicant, can you meet them? And then the applicant would say, okay, we can meet them, or we can't, or we do this, or we do that. But generally, you're going to say, okay, yeah, we accept. The authority closes the issue paper, and then they're able to put out the special condition. So now that forms part of the certification basis to say, okay, for that particular function, you now have coverage from a regulatory level through the vehicle of a special condition, because it's not in the actual requirements. Now, if this technology keeps being used and is very common and other OEMs want to use it, then the authority might go, okay, maybe we treat this as a priority, and next time we do a regulatory standard update, we incorporate that in there so we don't have to keep issuing special conditions, because special conditions are issued on a one-off basis. So every product would have its own. So if other OEMs would have this, then theoretically the authority would have to issue a special condition on that product because they're not transferable. So it's a lot of work for the authority as well. But I am still in the position where I need to certify a product. How can I do it? The vehicle is the special condition. Then, and in short, the authority will come up with requirements. The OEM will have to meet them, and then they get a special condition to say, okay, this is now certified, essentially outside of the regulatory framework, but here is the requirements that it has to meet and always has to abide by, because it's part of the certification basis. If I now do a design change in that area, these are the requirements that I now have that form the basis for the if I'm going to make a change to that area. This forms part of the certification basis these are not necessarily on every single aircraft. Some of these might not be standard. Like there's special conditions that form part of the certification basis, but maybe not every aircraft comes with them. So you would only, like, again, the operator doesn't necessarily need, the operator wouldn't have access to the requirements. That's going to be the OEM. But to even get that function, these might not be standard on every aircraft. Some of them might be options. Some of them might be, whatever. But let's say you had an aircraft already and you're already in the field and you want to install a certain system that, let's say there was a magic mod and this aircraft was not built with side stick controllers, but you want to put side stick controllers on it. Well, Transport Canada, if you're in Canada, Transport Canada doesn't have requirements in the AWM for it. So then the STC, because now you're going to do an STC because the airplane's already in service, the STC holder would have to go and work with Transport Canada to get a special condition to be able to change your column to a side stick controller.
Okay. And so I suspect these documents stays with the TC holder. The client
Correct.
never see them.
Exactly.
Okay?
So all of these things listed here on the special conditions, these are functionality that all the aircrafts might have, or maybe some, or it could be options or whatever, but all the data supporting it, all the requirements that the authority issued for them to respond to are with the TC holder. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's special conditions. The second part of your question was ELOS. So it's another regulatory instrument. In this case, I'm an OEM, I want to meet a requirement, but because the requirements are very specific. Let's say through the design, through the evolution of the product, I can't meet the requirement 100%. Whatever the case may be, I can only meet it 99% of the way. I can't, for whatever reason, I can't close that gap because of the design of the product or the product's intended operation. The ELOS, equivalent level of safety, or ESF, equivalent safety finding, is again a regulatory instrument that the authority can say, okay, you've requested this, again, vehicle issue paper, because these are what we need to be safe. This is the requirement per the standards, whether it's, Part 25, AWM 525, CS 25, whatever it is. And you're saying, applicant, you can't meet it. Well, we need that 1% or 5% or whatever that gap is. How are we going to be able to mitigate that safety gap? And if the OEM applicant can justify to the authority that this is still safe, even though I don't meet the requirement 100%, I meet it 99%, but I'm also doing something, this delta, then the authority can grant an ESF and say, okay, essentially, you're close enough. You also have some mitigation in place to maintain the same level of safety as if you were to meet the requirement word for word, and therefore we will grant you that you are compliant with that requirement with the ESF. So your 99% plus your ESF equals 100% compliance with that requirement. I think of I don't think it's an ELOS, or I think exit signs sometimes are ELOS, or there's an exemption with the side-facing seats. Because there's requirements that says you can't have more than 2 seats beside each other. So there's a lot of these private aircraft have like 3 abreast benches, like seating configuration. So they go for exemption or ELOS or other thing to say, hey, they're safe and here's why. And then the authority can grant approval essentially through that other means to say, okay, yeah, it's still safe even though it doesn't meet the requirement 100%.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, of an example where head strike standards for, like you say, bench seatings, for a seat that's adjacent to a bulkhead, for instance, that ordinarily would not meet the standard. But a mitigating measure would be to put a pad, on a removable pad on the bulkhead
Yeah.
that has to be in place for takeoff and landing.
Mhm.
So there would be
There
a
you go.
placard involved and things of that nature. So the aircraft itself, I mean, that it wouldn't meet the standard, the type certification standard, but by mitigating it, then that could be acceptable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It's like, you know, you're so close to being compliant with the wording as written, but for whatever reason I can't 100%. So there's that agreement with the authority that, okay, you can deviate from that, but you have some kind of mitigation in place to maintain, and that's why it's an equivalent level of safety, to maintain that same level of safety as the requirement is written, and therefore it's acceptable to use. But you know, it has to be completely identified. It can't just disappear in the paperwork, and that's why, you know, equivalent safety findings or ELOS, equivalent level of safety, are specifically spelled out in the TCDS.
That's fascinating. So I suppose that these equivalent safety findings from Transport Canada for this specific product, is there the possibility that some may not be accepted by another authority if I, you know?
So, I mean, you know, the big authorities, you know, the big four, ANAC, TC, FAA, and EASA, I mean, they have a certain, they're the big four, I guess, for a reason. But you're right, it could be, or it could be that an authority would have to issue their own. I mean, they could outright accept what Transport Canada has done, you know, or there could be a bilateral in place. But I think the larger thing that you raise is if you are to do a validation into another country from the OEM side, that would be something that the other country might want to look at. So they might ask the OEM, or they might ask the authority, hey, can you provide us information on these ESFs that you issued? Because we'd like to get a better understanding of, well, why didn't it meet the requirement, and what was that mitigating delta that you saw as appropriate to be able to issue an ELOS. You know, I would imagine that nobody or no authority would outright reject, you know, a fellow competent authority's you know, decision, but that doesn't mean that there can't be questions. That doesn't mean that the other authority isn't going to say, hey, I'd like to look into that, or hey, you know, I'd like to see how that was justified. You know, that kind of thing happens all the time.
Yeah, I'm just thinking the circumstance where I've seen, for instance, EASA may have a standard that addresses something that Transport Canada issued a special condition on. And so in their type certificate data sheet, they will say that standard such and such was met by special condition, Transport Canada special condition such and such. And that's their way of saying that it does in fact meet their EASA, the CS25 or whatever.
Exactly, and that's a good point, and that's kind of the natural extension to the previous conversation, which was, yeah, maybe in the Canadian framework, to issue those special conditions had to be done because there weren't requirements, but that doesn't mean that in FAA or EASA or ANAC or in other jurisdictions that they don't have requirements that could be met. So exactly, you know, for the FAA certification basis or EASA, we might not have to have those and say, okay, you know, it's met. But if you're referencing the Canadian one, then yeah, you would reference the SCA. That's all.
Okay, so moving on to placards. So there is a part here just after all of this that we just talked, placards, page 25. So they say that placards must be installed in accordance with Bombardier drawings, and then they make all the list. I wanted to point this out because they are very important for, again, delivery and redelivery of aircraft, particularly if you change jurisdiction and stuff like that, there might be additional requirements. And those are references that you can use when you take delivery of an aircraft and you check the status of placards and if they are all there. So I suppose these drawings are provided to the client at delivery?
To be honest, I'm not necessarily sure, but at least from a certification perspective, what this is conveying is that there are placards. We don't know what placards they're in response to. They could be a variety. It could be the weight placard, you know, speed placards, a variety of things. It could be, you know, placards inside the cockpit to talk about, you know, egress, Again, in this case, this is a green aircraft configuration, so there wouldn't necessarily be placards inside the cabin because you don't have an installed cabin. But to our previous conversation, you have placards for a variety of things in the interior as well, different languages for signs, egress, that kind of thing. But those don't come from nothing. You just can't, write on a piece of paper, or you just can't cut out a piece of material and glue it to the side of the thing. You need documentation and control. That placard is a certain size, has certain lettering, has certain color for a reason. Everything, remember, in aviation, everything is very specific. Everything is highly regulated for a reason. So to support that placard, how it looks, the size of it, what it says would be captured in these drawings. And those drawings would have to go through the certification process that the OEM would have. So not necessarily, because your original question, would the OEM or would the operator get all of these drawings? Not necessarily, because they need to know that they have a certificated product. They were delivered that, and there you go. But again, if I now make a change and I have my aircraft for a year or two and I want to make a bunch of STCs, and I now have to have new placards, well, then I may have to go back to the OEM to understand, okay, about the previous placard, or now the STC holder is taking responsibility for that new placard that they're putting on the aircraft. And the STC holder similarly has to meet the appropriate requirements, and they're going to have to do a drawing to support the installation of that placard as well. And then now that becomes part of the type design configuration.
I suppose some of them will end up in Chapter 11 of the Aircraft Maintenance Manual, right?
You can find them quite often in different areas. Some will be in SBs, some will be in maintenance manuals. A very common practice is you paint the aircraft. Well, there's all kinds of placards on the exterior of the aircraft that have to be put back on, and if you don't have the drawings in the maintenance manual or some other document, you have to go to the OEM. They might be placards that are affixed, or they might be silk screened on or whatever, but if you don't have it and you don't know the given standard for it, you can't do what's referred to as a replacement part and just affix something. You have to go back to the OEM.
Yeah, that's why I was asking if those drawings are given to the operator, because very often, particularly with commercial operators, they paint the aircraft, right?
Yeah, and I find with most OEMs, they have different things. Some OEMs, they give you all kinds of drawings. Other OEMs, that's protected, and they want money every time you ask for something. So
every OEM will be different. I was thinking of like max zero fuel weight or max takeoff weight, and those kind of placards. Same kind of thing. If you want to change your if you want to do for some mod for some reason, because you want to increase your payload, you want to change your max zero fuel weight by an STC, you may have to go back to the OEM. It really depends on the situation, but suffice it to say, in this case, they've identified what drawings contain these placards. You don't know what placards they are. You just know that there are the associated drawings with them. And then, it may come down to the, commercial arrangement, again, if you need help from the OEM.
One example I've seen with the business jet is with the, excuse me, a number of the Gulf Streams. They're just over the weight limit to go into certain airports. So by placarding the aircraft and limiting the weight of the aircraft by installing a placard, they can go into airports with weight limitations. An interesting aspect, again, getting back to the maintenance entry, if you change the placard, changing the certified weight of the aircraft, it requires to be entered into the technical record of the aircraft. And beyond that, different portions of the AFM come into play, so the pilot needs to be made aware of it. And so this would be an instance where the pilot has to be made aware. And how would that be? That would be in the aircraft technical record that they should be reviewing before they go flying, right?
Right.
Exactly. They need to know what's installed. If they have an SB that says, it can't fly into the airports at this weight at these times or whatever, they need to know that.
Okay, so I would like to go very briefly through the EASA and the FAA just to identify a few things. So EASA, the type certificate data sheet, like the Transport Canada, includes all three models. And I would like to go to page 32. And I was wondering if you can explain what operational suitability data is, or
Oh,
OSD.
yes. Yeah, I spent a good portion of my time at Bombardier supporting that. So essentially what happened is, at least at this time, EASA is the only jurisdiction that has taken part of essentially what was post-type certification activities and brought it into the type certification activity. So OSD, for example, it's flight crew data, cabin crew data for commercial aircraft. There is MMEL, simulator data, and maintenance data. So normally what would happen is you'd have an MMEL, which would go as part of, kind of in parallel with certification, safety, non-critical systems, that if they're inoperative, you can operate. That's why we have an MMEL, because otherwise anything that's not on an MMEL, essentially if, a light bulb goes out, then your aircraft is grounded. What EASA decided to do was say, okay, well, this should be part of certification activities. So rather than it happening after or going in parallel and then being certified after the product is type certified, they basically said it needs to be done together. So now if you have, for example, the MMEL argument I was making, if I require an MMEL or an MMEL change as part of another design change that I was doing, and used to be able to do batch approvals of these a long time after, you can't do that now. If the MMEL is triggered because of a design change that I'm doing, I now have to make that MMEL change for the EASA part at the same time. So they've essentially made it as part of certification exercise. So rather than like TC and FAA, where, if I want to change my MMEL, whatever, from 1 day to 5 days, alleviation, relief, then, I can do that after, no problem. But for EASA, it's like, oh, no. If you are going to change your MMEL, you got to do it as part of this design change activity. And you have to identify that. And you have to identify it up front. So it's caused a little bit of disconnect in how the authorities approach things, because you're still going to do the MMEL, but for EASA, when you're validating with them, in our case, from Canada, then you need to make sure you're actually doing that up front with them as part of the validation activity. It can't be done after.
So potentially you could end up with an EASA MMEL that is current and addresses certain aspects that Transport Canada MMEL would not.
I guess theoretically it's possible, but I think the way that OEMs have dealt with it is that they're doing the MMEL stuff up front. So even though FAA and EASA don't require it, the submission of that is going in, because you don't want to have that disconnect or that disconnect for very long. But you also have to realize too how validations happen. Sometimes they're happening concurrently and sometimes they're happening staggered. So if they're happening staggered, it's not a problem, because I've probably already put in my application. I'm already dealing with Transport Canada to approve my MMEL as I'm going through the validation with EASA, and the MMEL is just going to be part of that anyway. It really would be if it was kind of concurrent. TC does, Transport Canada, FAA don't necessarily require that for certification, but EASA requires it for their validation. So I kind of have to do it all together anyways up front, because you don't want that disconnect. You don't want something that Transport Canada is going to, you don't know if Transport Canada is going to approve it or not, and then EASA is going to approve it. So, you still want Transport Canada to, in our case, to approve it first.
Well, I'm guessing, or I'm almost certain though, that also the authority that will be accepting the type or validating the type would rely will rely heavily on the design authority's input, right?
Correct.
So, like you say, they're going to have Transport Canada input to have the MMEL validated for their authority, right? So it's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so they may have their own MMEL and they do their own activity, but in the end, exactly, you don't want to have it not complete your certifying authority when the validating authority is going to have it out. So essentially, all OSD, even though Transport Canada and FAA don't have it, it just means that you kind of need to be on it more. I'm using MMEL as an example. There's of course other constituent parts of OSD, but you want to basically, if you do have an MMEL change, you want to have it up front and done because EASA has to have it as part of the validation activity and can't be done after. So
right.
Okay. So now to conclude our interview, which went very long as usual because we have so much to say, I would like to go through a couple of points for the FAA type certificate data sheet. Like the other two, they cover all three models, and I find quite interesting a part like page 18. They talk about additional design requirements and conditions. They talk about an engine damage from wing ice caused by cold soaked fuel, and they talk about in-flight engine restart. Yeah, this I found it very interesting. Would you like to comment on this that I did not see on the other two?
Right. So, I mean, we also need to understand that, every authority kind of has their own way of doing TCDSs, and the majority are, the contents are, 95% the same or 98% the same. And there are efforts to, make them more consistent across the authorities. But in the end, each authority still has, and as we've talked, there are little differences that need to be respected and are reflected. And in one case, as you point out, in this case, in the FAA world, they have additional design requirements and conditions, what they call ADRCs for short, which is essentially providing a note or bringing your attention to or focus to specific items. And before a pilot gets in an aircraft, they want to bring attention to this kind of thing, saying, okay, there's for this particular item, there's a specific procedure in the AFM or in the FCOM or whatever it may be, or if there's or if there's an issue, how it can be brought up, or where you can go to get the information. So again, even though the majority of what's on TCDSs are similar or maybe packaged slightly differently, but the material is the same, there are some areas where like in the FAA case, where they just want to bring attention to specific items, and that might be different from an FAA or sorry, a TC or the EASA TCDS.
Okay, so related to this, there is a note 21 on page 22 that I find interesting for this particular model 7500. They say the FAA has concluded that the occurrence of any uncontrollable high thrust failure condition or any of the associated casual failures listed within Global 7500 aircraft maintenance publication may endanger the safe operation of an airplane. And then there is so they say the FAA recommends that operators be encouraged to report any such failures in accordance with the rules. Would you like to comment on this? This is another thing that I didn't see. Why are they bringing up uncontrollable high thrust failure condition?
Right. So, and again, it comes down to, their little minutia between authorities about what they want to convey in their TCDS or not. In this case, the FAA has said for this potential failure condition, which is, not something that's going to happen often or hopefully won't happen in the lifetime of the aircraft. If there is something related to this, this is where you can find information in the maintenance publication, and that the FAA recommends that operators report per their, reporting structure. So in the Transport Canada world, there's SDRs, service difficulty reports, and that's captured in CAR 521. In the FAA world, here, 121, 125, 135, that's the FAA operational requirements. But yeah, essentially they're just, bringing attention that, hey, there is the possibility for this, there is a maintenance procedure on it. And if any such thing related to this happens, there's an obligation for operators to report it per those requirements. So again, it was just a case of FAA seeing as this is something it's important to bring attention to, so they've put it into the TCDS.
Okay.
And it could be there could be a variety of reasons why. It could be because of their regulatory framework. It could be because of their whatever obligations for operator requirements. There could be a number of different reasons why, but for the FAA, it was seen as needed to be put in there, and for Transport Canada and EASA, it wasn't necessarily seen as necessary.
Yeah, it could be something as simple as it constitutes a reportable event under their regulations where it doesn't under ours.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was just curious because I thought, wow, they are really being precise here with what they want to be reported. Okay. So do you have any other comments or notes?
No, I enjoyed today. I think there was a lot of good information. I mean, we could go on forever about type certificates and data sheets and differences and examples and everything else, but
Yeah.
I thought it was good.
Yeah, very good. And prepare yourself. I would like an interview on maintenance program, which I suppose is going to be a number of interviews because it's such a huge topic, but prepare yourself.
Okay, no problem. No, listen, as always, I enjoy talking with you both, and I thought it was a good conversation. And yeah, we really only scratched the surface, but I think at least it gives a good overview of why the TCDS is important, what it contains, why why the information is there, and the slight differences of what's important for one authority might not necessarily be important for another authority, but the bulk of the information is consistent amongst them. But I appreciate the invitation, and I'm always happy to come back and talk with you both and share what I know about aviation. So.
Oh, you will be back. You will be back. We have a schedule for you already laid out.
Oh,
don't worry
okay,
about it.
All right. Well, I'll keep that in mind.
No, we really appreciate your input and your openness and you're willing to share and help just foster everything in the industry. I think it's great.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hope it's one way for me to convey my knowledge and that I've spent my entire career doing this kind of work and certification, and it's nice to be able to share and to to help give that knowledge to other people, at least in a small way.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. So I would like to remind everybody that we already had an episode with you about the certification process. So I will add the link to this interview, which is one of the best interviews so far in terms of views. So apparently people enjoy the discussion. I'm very happy about it because we really touched on a lot of different topics in that interview. And I'll put also all your contact like we did last time. So if people wants to reach out to you, they can. And thank you so much, Adam. We'll see you very, very soon.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Annalisa. Anytime. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Talk
soon. Bye now.